Hello YouTube, my name is Daniel, and welcome to another edition of Education 180. You may be wondering why I'm sitting here making this YouTube video for you. Well, here's the deal. Today, I'll be talking about the first section in the analytical reasoning module on the OR diagram. You may be wondering what the OR diagram is. Often, you will find that an object can be displayed in one of two positions. When you encounter this circumstance, it is often wise to produce two alternate diagrams, which is referred to as OR diagrams. You may then continue to plot further information in each of the two OR diagrams. You should not, however, produce more than two alternate diagrams, as your master diagram would become unduly cumbersome. It is also important to be aware of the general methodology when completing analytical reasoning type questions. There are 4 problems with 5 to 7 questions each. Problems provide a set of conditions, represent conditions in the form of a diagram or chart. Look for hidden conditions, find your rhythm, and watch language, i.e. must versus could. Please take a moment to read through OR diagram sample question 1. Press pause, and when you are ready to continue, press play. We will continue. Let's read through the following question together. The aunties are seated for tea around a circular table that seats 6. The aunties are Bertie, Claudette, Dottie, Ethel, Fern, and Gertrude. The seating arrangements must meet the following conditions. Condition number 1. Gertrude must not be seated next to Claudette. So Gertrude and Claudette do not get along, so they can't be seated next to each other. Condition number 2. Bertie must not be seated next to Ethel. Again, Bertie and Ethel do not get along very well. They're not the best of friends, so they cannot be seated next to each other. Condition number 3. Ethel must be seated next to Fern. So Ethel and Fern are the best of friends. They enjoy each other's company, so they want to be seated next to each other. So those are the 3 conditions. And when you're doing these types of questions, we've represented them in pictures, but it's also important to represent them with letters as well, to make it easier to answer the questions as you go along in the passage. So this symbol right here just means can't equal. And we said can't equal GC or CG. So remember in the question that they're seated around a round table. There are 6 seats. So, if Gertrude was seated here, Claudette couldn't be seated here or here. So that's why we have can equal GC or CG. Same with the second condition, can't equal BE or EB. And the last one, EF or FE. So that just means that Ethel must be seated next to Fern, or Fern must be seated next to Ethel. Either or, depending on how you look at the round table. And we can also represent the information in a diagram. So in the first diagram up here, we'll label this diagram number 1. We've started with the letters B, C, D, E, F, and G. And C and D and C are interchangeable. They can switch spots. E and F are interchangeable. They can switch spots. Should keep the labeling the same, so and what else? We've got B. B is constrained here because it can't be next to E, which is over here. G is constrained because it can't be next to C. So we've got B, G in the order that we have it. And that's about it for the first diagram. In the second diagram, we've got D and B and BD as interchangeable in these two places, but C is constrained because it can't be next to G, and E and F are constrained because E can't be next to B. So E is constrained over here, and then F would be constrained here to separate the E from the B. So those are our two diagrams that we can draw based on the information in the passage. And now we will do question 1. Please take a moment to read through question 1 of the OR diagram. Press pause, and when you are ready to continue, press play. We will continue. So question 1 reads as follows. If Fern is seated to the immediate right of Birdie, who must be seated to the immediate right of Fern? We have A. Birdie, B. Claudette, C. Dottie, D. Ethel, and E. Gertrude. So let's underline the key information that we're looking for. So if Fern is seated to the right of Birdie, who must be seated to the right of Fern? So we've started off with Fern, which is seated right here, and we know that she's to the immediate right of Birdie. So the question is, who's seated to the right of Fern? And when answering these types of questions, my first reaction is to immediately go to the conditions and have a look. And as I scan them, I clue into the third condition, which is right here. And I notice that it should be either EF or FE. So that tells me that E needs to be next to F. And since B is right here, I know that E would need to be right there based on the third condition. So I can clue in to D as being the correct answer based on the third condition. And D is in fact the correct response. Please take a moment to read through question 2. Press pause, and when you are ready to continue, press play. We will continue. So let's read the question together. Which one is a possible seating arrangement? We have A. Ethel, Birdie, Fern, Gertrude, Claudette, Dottie. B. Ethel, Birdie, Gertrude, Claudette, Fern, and Dottie. C. We have Gertrude, Dottie, Claudette, Birdie, Ethel, and Fern. D. We have Gertrude, Fern, Ethel, Claudette, Birdie, and Dottie. And E. We have Gertrude, Birdie, Fern, Ethel, Dottie, and Claudette. So again, my first reaction is to take a look at the conditions right over here and see if these conditions can eliminate any of the answer choices. Normally, if we're lucky, the conditions will at least get rid of one or two so we don't have to draw a diagram. In this case, we're even luckier because it actually eliminates 4 out of the 5 answer choices. Let's take a look at them together. So for A, we have Ethel, Birdie, Fern, Gertrude, Claudette, and Dottie. Well, I immediately clue into Ethel and Birdie because it breaks condition 2. So we can eliminate A from our answer choices. B is Ethel Birdie. Well, without even reading the rest of the list. Sorry, that was condition 2. Without even reading the rest of the names, we know that it breaks condition 2. And we eliminate B. C says Gertrude, Dottie, Claudette, Birdie, Ethel, and Fern. Again, we see Birdie and Ethel together, and we know from condition 2 that they cannot be. So we eliminate C from our answer choices. D is Gertrude, Fern, Ethel, Claudette, Birdie, and Dottie. Upon first analysis, we don't see that there are any immediate rules broken. So I'll put a star beside it, and I'll come back to it. Let's take a look at E to see if any rules are broken here. For E, we have Gertrude, Birdie, Fern, Ethel, Dottie, and Claudette. Recall that they're seated around a round table with 6 seats. And we have Gertrude at the start and Claudette at the finish. And we know, based on the first condition, that Claudette and Gertrude can't be seated next to each other. So we can eliminate E from our answer choices. And D is the last one remaining, so we know that that is our correct answer choice. Please take a moment to read through question 3. Press pause, and when you are ready to continue, press play. We will continue. Let's read through question 3 together. If Ethel is seated next to Claudette, which is a complete and accurate list of the aunties that can be seated on the other side of Claudette? So for A, we have Dottie. B, we have Dottie and Birdie. C, we have Dottie, Birdie, and Fern. D, Fern, Birdie, and Gertrude. And E, we have Dottie, Fern, Birdie, and Gertrude. So let's take a look at it step by step. So we have at the top here, if Ethel is seated next to Claudette, which is a complete and accurate list of aunties that can be seated on the other side of Claudette. So if we start with Ethel right here, and we know that she's seated next to Claudette, we put Claudette here. We know that Fern needs to be seated next to Ethel based on condition 3. So F would be placed right here. And what else can we determine? We know that G and C can't be next to each other. So we can place G right here so it doesn't break the first condition, which is right here. And we know that B and E can't be next to each other. But at this point it doesn't matter because E is in between C and F. So our remaining letters are B and D. And B and D are interchangeable. It could be either here or it could be here. So when we look at our answer choices, it looks like B is the correct response, because B has Dottie and Birdie. So just to recap, F has to be beside E and G, can't be beside C. Only B and D can be beside C. Please take a moment to read through question 4. Press pause, and when you are ready to continue, press play. So question 4 reads as follows. If Gertrude is seated next to Ethel and Bertie is seated next to Fern, who must be seated on the other side of Bertie? And we have A, Claudette, B, Dottie, C, Ethel, D, Fern, and E, Gertrude. So let's take a look at the question together. We start off with, if Gertrude is seated next to Ethel, Gertrude is next to Ethel, and Bertie is next to Fern, who must be seated on the other side of Bertie? So we start off with Gertrude, and we know that she's seated next to Ethel. And we know from condition 3 that Fern must be seated next to Ethel, so she'd be on the other side of E. We know that Bertie is seated next to Fern, so Bertie would have to be over here, next to Fern. Who must be seated on the other side of Bertie? So we know that we have C and D left. And just for argument's sake, we can try C over here and D over here. But we know if we have it this way, it would break condition 1. Because C, we would have the case of CG. CG can't be beside each other. So, really, we can cross out C and all... Wait, we can cross out D, because D would have to come back down here. And the only possibility that's left is C. And A is our correct answer choice. Please take a moment to read through question 5. Press pause, and when you are ready to continue, press play. Let's take a look at question 5 together. If Gertrude and Dottie are seated across from each other, who must be seated on either side of Claudette? So for A, we have Ethel and Dottie. B, we have Ethel and Bertie. C, we have Dottie and Fern. D, we have Dottie and Bertie. And E, we have Fern and Gertrude. So let's take a look at this question together. It starts off by saying, if Gertrude and Dottie are seated across from each other, who must be seated on either side of Claudette? So we can start off with Gertrude, and we draw Dottie on the opposite side. And then the remaining question is, who must be seated on either side of Claudette? So what else do we know? We know that G can't be next to C. So we know that C can't be here. So we can place it over here. We know that E and F need to be next to each other. So there's really only one place that they could be, which is over here. And what else can we say? Who's on either side of Claudette? Really, there are only 2 possibilities remaining. Because since E and F need to be next to each other, G and D are across from each other, C has only one spot over here, so it'd have to be B and D remaining based on the conditions. So D is our credited response. Let's try one scenario, shall we? This is our OR diagram second scenario. Please take a moment to read through the following question. Press pause, and when you are ready to continue, press play. Let's read through the following question together. 8 dinner guests A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and H are to be seated at a square table, 2 per side. The seating arrangements must conform to the following conditions. The first one, write a number 1. D cannot sit next to B, and we've represented it with symbols over here. Can't equal DB or BD. 2. B and H must both sit immediately beside C. So that means in symbols we have BCH or HCB. So C will always be in the middle. It'll be next to B and H. And condition 3. G must sit directly across from E. So I've represented it with a symbol, like a fraction symbol in mathematics. If you have G on top of E. It could also be written this way if you wanted to. But I tend to, when I'm writing the LSAT, keep it as simple as possible so I don't have too many symbols on my page. And we can also represent it in a diagram as follows. So we have, let's break it down. D cannot sit next to B. We know that we have our BCH over here. We have G directly across from E. And we have ADF can be over here. ADF can be over here, and F and A are over here. And why is it just F and A? Because of condition number 1. D can't be next to B. So that's the basic diagram that we can use to work with. And let's take a look at the questions. Please take a moment to read through question 1. Press pause, and when you are ready to continue, press play. Let's read through the following question together. Number 1 says, how many people could be seated directly across from C? So A says 1, B says 2, C is 3, D 4, or E 5. Now, we've started off with a basic box for a diagram, but we know that we've already have a pre-sketched diagram from the initial question when we plotted out the conditions. So we can take this diagram and just take a look at it, and we look at C, which is right here, and it says how many people could be seated directly across from C. So we look across, and we see that there are 3 potential people that could be seated across from C. So all we have to do is look at our answer choices, and we see that C is the correct response. Please take a moment to read through question 2. Press pause. When you are ready to continue, press play. We will continue. So number 2 says, if G does not sit next to H, then which of the following is not possible? A says, if D sits next to G, then F could sit directly across from B. B says, if D sits next to F, then A could sit directly across from H. C says, if D could sit next to H, it just says D could sit next to H. So D is if D sits next to E, then G could sit between F and A. And E says if D sits next to G, then C could sit next to E. So let's break it down step by step. First off, let's take a look at A. So it is also important to clue into the last part of the question, because this will determine which answer you're looking for. Which of the following is not? Underlying not in red, so you clue into it. Which one is not possible? So all the possible ones are the ones you get rid of, and the one that is not possible is the correct answer. So let's take a look at A. If D sits next to G, then F could sit directly across from B. So let's take a look at that. So if D sits next to G, well, D is next to G right here, then F could sit directly across from B. Let's make sure that the three conditions are met. So the first condition is can equal DB or BD. I don't see that, so the first condition is approved. BCH or HCB, we've got our BCH right here. So condition 2 is approved, and we have G across from E. So condition 3 is approved. So A can be eliminated because this is a possible seating arrangement. Let's take a look at B. So we know that A is eliminated. If D sits next to F, then A could sit directly across from H. So let's take a look at it. If D sits next to F, so we've got D next to F right here, then A could sit directly across from H. So that part is accomplished. Now let's see if the conditions are met. First condition, DB or BD. They're not sitting beside each other. B is down here. So this is accomplished. Second one, BCH or HCB. We've got BCH right here. So that one's accomplished. And the third one, GE, well, G and E are across from each other. So this one is accomplished. So B is eliminated. Next one. D could sit next to H. We've got D and H down here. So D is not next to B because B is over here. So that one's accomplished. BCH. Yes, we got it right here. And G is across from E. So this one's accomplished. So C is also eliminated. Let's take a look at D. If D sits next to E, then G could sit between F and A. So let's make sure D is next to E. Then G could sit between F and A. So G is between F, and G is between A. Let's make sure the three conditions are met. B is down here, not next to D, so that's accomplished. We got our BCH, and G is directly across from E. So this one is also possible, so we eliminate D. So chances are E is going to be our correct answer. Let's just take a look just to make sure. If D sits next to G, then C can sit next to E. Okay, so let's break this down. If D sits next to G, So here we've got D next to G. Then C could sit next to E. This would break the condition number 2. Because if C was moved over here, let's just move it to show you. If C was moved over here, and let's move the B down here, then C would no longer be between B, C, and H. It needs to be over here. So condition 2 is broken, so we know that E is the correct response because it is not possible.